seen all the Best Picture nominees, so let's talk about the Banshees of Inisherin. What is it? It is a black comedy / drama. Wikipedia calls it a black tragicomedy about the dissolution of a friendship. At least that's what it appears to be about at first, but more on that in future TikToks. There are these two guys who've been friends for years. Calm, played by Brendan Gleeson, and Pádraig, played by Colin Farrell. And one day, Calm tells Pádraig he doesn't want to be friends anymore and wants to be left alone. And he's in fact willing to take drastic measures to ensure he is left alone. And this sudden, inexplicable, potentially violent decree by Calm throws Pádraig and their entire community into disarray. Who is it made by? It is the fourth movie written and directed by Martin McDonagh. You may know him as the director of In Bruges and 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. You may also know him as one of the most acclaimed and celebrated playwrights of the last 30 years, or you may know him as the romantic partner of Phoebe Waller-Bridge. How'd you like the first drafts of your screenplays to be read and critiqued by Phoebe Waller-Bridge? Damn. How has it been received? It hit theaters in October and did decent business, $37 million against a $20 million budget, but it seems to have done really, really well on HBO Max, where it's been streaming since December. We don't have numbers on that, but it's just a sense I've gotten based on how much I see people talking about it and that kind of thing. It's received universal acclaim from critics, many calling it McDonagh's most mature film to date, which is often another way of saying it's his most challenging or most difficult film. But praise across the board for the writing and the performances, 4 of which are nominated for Oscars. And in addition to those 4 acting nominations and the Best Picture nomination, it's also nominated for Director, Original Screenplay, Film Editing, and Original Score from the great Carter Burwell. And just personally, this is probably the best movie of the year for me. I don't know if it's the best movie of the year for everyone. You know, Top Gun's great, Tar's great, Everything Everywhere is great, but I think Banshees is really, really good. And I also think it's really, really my kind of movie. It's a very Josh movie. Who would like this? Anyone who likes to laugh at wry humor, but also likes to be immensely sad. This is billed as a comedy, and I definitely think it's funny, but be warned, it's more sad than funny. Anyone who enjoys talking about a movie over a cup of coffee after you see it. It invites interpretation. Here's a fun question. After the events of the movie, what does the next day look like for these characters? Incidentally, that's a fun question to ask at the end of any Martin McDonagh movie. Your parents who have always talked about going to Ireland, but haven't. I watched this with my parents, and at least 4 or 5 different times there'd be an establishing shot of scenery, and my dad just went, wow. More in part 2. The setup of the movie is the dissolution of a friendship, where Calm just decides one day he doesn't want to be friends with Pádraig anymore. But what's really going on here? What is this? In some capacity, it's the story about small town life, about the ups and downs of living in an insular, gossipy community where everyone knows everyone, but also nothing ever really happens. For some people, that's an ideal life, and for other people, that's a prison. I think it's also about the walls we put up around ourselves, how we insulate ourselves from other people. It's not an accident that the first 3 or 4 times Pádraig and Calm interact, it's through a window, through a literal barrier. Also, there are stone walls lining the paths that crisscross the island of Inisherin, and characters literally hide from other characters behind these walls, multiple times. Pádraig is such an open book. He lets people in. He lets his donkey Jenny into the house despite his sister's constant protests. And Calm is the opposite. He has his walls up. Which is why I think the very, very end of the movie is interesting, given what happens to Calm's walls, but no spoilers. But really, I think the movie is about confronting mortality. Eventually, Calm does explain to Pádraig why he doesn't want to be friends anymore, and it's basically a 3/4 life crisis about what he's leaving behind. He feels his life is slipping away, and he'd rather spend however much time he has left composing music rather than just idly chatting with Pádraig. We only get a few scenes explicitly from Calm's point of view, but notably 2 of them are confessions to a priest. And both times the priest asks him, how's the despair? Indicating that this has been an ongoing problem for Calm, that he's depressed. What Calm's doing, while not without reason, is really unfair to Pádraig. He's despairing about his own mortality and what he's leaving behind, and so he decides to blame that on Pádraig rather than on his own idleness. He's trying to find external blame for an internal problem. And what's worse is the drastic, violent lengths Calm is willing to go to make sure Pádraig doesn't talk to him. It's an escalation and a bit of a literalization of his blaming Pyrick for his lack of composing music and lack of music output. He is choosing to harm himself and compromise his ability to play his instrument, which was the whole reason behind this depressive episode, and again, places the blame for this at Pyrick's feet, literally, and effectively says, "Look what you made me do." Reading between the lines, Calm isn't ending his friendship with Pyrick for the opportunity to write and play more music. He's doing it so he has someone to blame for not writing and playing more music. So when he does eventually die, he can tell himself, "I would have done more if it wasn't for Pyrick," and he's lying to himself. In Bruges is one of my all-time favorites. If you're unfamiliar, In Bruges, much like Banshees, was written and directed by Martin McDonagh, stars Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson, and is funny, sad, violent, and thought-provoking. In Bruges, Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson are hitmen who go into hiding in the titular Bruges, and Brendan Gleeson's character Ken really likes it, finds it to be a really pleasant, slower-paced, charming city, and Colin Farrell's character Ray absolutely hates it, thinks it's boring, and wants to die. On the special features of the DVD, Martin McDonagh says he took a trip to Bruges when he was younger, and one part of him was really charmed by it, and one part of him was bored crazy by it. So he took his two reactions, the two sides of himself, and put them into two characters who would be at odds with each other. Banshees is also a movie about two characters with conflicting points of view. Ultimately, it's conflicting points of view on mortality, but that's like a half step below the surface in the subtext. In this, Brendan Gleeson's character, Calm, believes that he needs to spend his time making art, creating things, leaving something behind, something that might last. Colin Farrell's character, Pyrick, believes that life should be spent enjoying oneself, and it's good to be nice, and that the people who love you will remember you, so who cares if you leave something behind? Given how, in Bruges, McDonagh admitted to putting two versions of himself into the two characters at odds, I have to wonder if he's doing something similar here. On the one hand, he's a filmmaker, and as Gene Smart and Babylon will tell you, these movies will outlive him, and he's creating something and leaving something behind. On the other hand, movies are really hard to make. They're very stressful, and they take up a lot of time. Maybe part of McDonagh thinks he'd be happier chilling out and living more slowly and simpler and just enjoying a pint. By now he's got the money. He doesn't need to keep pouring himself into movies if he doesn't want to. Maybe he's considered ending a friendship over his movie making. I'm kind of bummed by how much I relate to Calm, Brendan Gleeson's character. As I said in previous TikToks, I think the philosophical question at the center of the movie, the two sides of which are represented by the two main characters, is a question of mortality and what we leave behind and what makes life worth living. Having fun and enjoying yourself, or creating something that will outlive you. I really love watching movies. It's truly one of my favorite things, and it's how I love to spend my time. Nowadays, it's really hard for me to just sit down and watch a movie, because whenever I do, I start thinking, can I make a TikTok out of this? Do I have a take on this that I can tweet about? Can I make a YouTube video on this? Should I be taking notes for screenplay ideas, or for ideas for my own writing? Those are things constantly running through my head, and it's really hard for me to just turn that off and enjoy something. Is the Banshees of Inisherin a cautionary tale about this kind of mindset? Honestly, kind of hard to say. That kind of gets into how you think this conflict between these two characters is resolved, or is it resolved? Honestly, you could pull apart the last 5 minutes of this movie and come up with an answer to that. I come down on the side that these two make amends, at least a little bit, and that Calm backs off his music ambitions that are being driven by his fear of death, and instead decides to live a little more. He may not come all the way to Pyrick's side, but he moves closer. That's what I think happens, but, again, hard to say. I think there are subtle indications, but you have to both pay attention and extrapolate. I'm a big fan of Martin McDonagh. I realize some people considered it to be among the worst movies of the year, but I really liked Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. I thought it was extremely compelling and had interesting characters. Deeply flawed characters, but still interesting. Even so, I acknowledge there are several valid reasons to take issue with Three Billboards, one of which was that it included a fraught topic of American culture, namely a racist cop, and McDonagh is a white European man, and some people critical of the movie thought that McDonagh, as a cultural outsider, may have been a bit too blasé about that topic and was effectively using the tension between American cops and the black community and even violence against black people perpetrated by cops as a shorthand in characterization. I understand that complaint. I really do. It didn't necessarily hold me back from liking the movie, but it was certainly something I wrestled with a bit. Which is a very long way of saying I was relieved when I learned that McDonagh's next movie would take place in Ireland, where he's from. So I wouldn't have to wrestle with whether or not McDonagh was quote-unquote the right person to tell this story. And yet, because he grew up in London, some people are still accusing McDonagh of being a cultural outsider here, despite being Irish himself. Go figure. Cultural outsider or not, I really love the setting here and the Irishness of this movie. I'm extremely charmed by all those details. The accents absolutely sing. I love the sound of how these characters talk. I love the character names, Shaban, Colm, Pádraig Sulbayan. It's clear to see, like, the Anglicanized versions of these names. Like, in America, he'd be Patrick Sullivan, but the Irishness of this name is so cool to me. I love the sweaters. God, I love the sweaters. They're honestly one of my favorite parts of this or any movie from last year. I should say, I've only been to Ireland once. I don't know shit about Ireland, so to any Irish people watching, I'm sorry if I'm speaking out of turn here. I guess when I say I like the Irishness, I'm really referring to, like, the American cultural understanding of what we think Ireland is like. But respectfully, the lush green grass, the loose farm animals walking around, Guinness from a bottle because I guess kegs weren't around yet, the small town environment where everyone knows everyone. I just really like the setting of this movie. It's completely lovely.